So Will and Steve and Emily asked me to give just a quick overview of the cattle markets and what's happened in the wake of COVID-19. And I did want to start by just talking about what I was saying back in January. And the two reasons why I was generally optimistic about 2020 was the fact that the cow herd was finally smaller after about 6 years of expansion. We came into 2020 with a smaller cow herd, so we were going to see better things on at least the calf supply side. And then secondly, we had a lot of good news towards the end of 2019 on the trade front. Better access to Japan, USMCA. You haven't heard much about African swine fever, but it's still very much out there and very much a major issue. In fact, exports of pork into China have continued to be very high for that reason. And then, of course, China opened the doors to poultry, opened their door more to poultry from the U.S. back in, I think it was October of last year. So a lot of things were going to really be, a lot of things look like we're going to moving a whole lot of meat outside the U.S. in 2020. So that combined with a smaller calf crop, I was fairly optimistic. Something that hasn't, I don't think, got a lot of attention is that in some ways this hit us at almost the worst possible time for two major reasons. One, we were expecting larger production across the board of all meats. And then two, if you look at things like unemployment and whatnot back in January, there was not a lot of excess labor supply. So a lot of what's happened on the processing front has been kind of amplified by the fact that production and labor supply were probably an issue already. There's really almost been three phases of this to me. The February impact was more about trade and potential loss of export markets. March was really the domestic impact, as we started to see closures and decreased activity and layoffs and cancellations. And really the shift towards food service, towards at-home consumption, that was kind of the March impact, the demand impact. And then really starting about the second week of April going, and still ongoing, has been the supply chain disruption. I'm going to kind of start there. So what I'm showing you is cattle slaughter. So this is cattle slaughter. Blue line is 2020. First thing I will point out without talking much about it, those of you that might have been on the ag credit call yesterday, I talked a bit more about this, but we really pushed a lot of cattle through the system in February and March. And I think A, packers knew we had a lot of cattle to work through, and I think B, they expected maybe some labor issues to hit us at some point. So do note that for at least for 2 months of 2020, we really moved a lot of cattle. In fact, I actually built up cold storage for a period of time. To put this in perspective, though, this bottom that hit us, this has been 3 or 4 weeks ago now, that was about 35% below 2019 levels. So kind of let that sink in for a second. That's about a third less beef coming out of the system than we would have seen at the same time last year with more fed cattle on feed. Now, this is updated through last week. I don't have this week's yet, but we've seen a really nice run up in slaughter, which has helped a lot. But we're still running about 15% below year ago levels. And I don't know what the norm is going to be, but my guess is we're going to stay about 10% below last year, just because plants have had to space things out. They've had to slow lines down, put in protections and so forth. So we've definitely moved up, but I think we're still going to have some issues in terms of slaughter. Fed cattle price has responded as you would have thought that it would, although it dipped down below $1 in late April. Actually, last week it crossed 2019 levels. So we averaged about 117.50 last week for a fed steer. I think he'll be around 115 or so when the dust settles this week. In terms of Kentucky impact, and then I'll wrap things up here. When I try to look at the impact of of COVID on our cattle markets, I look at two things primarily. And I always say it this way: you can't just look at how much lower prices are than where they were back in June. You got to think about where they would have been. So first of all, the truth is our calf market is not that far off where it was in January. But what COVID did is it took out our seasonal spring run-up. So back in January, October feeder cattle futures were in mid upper 140s, and they got down to about 120 at one point there in late April. So those calves that moved through with the fall board in the 120s would have been probably 20, 25 cents a pound higher than they would if we'd still had a fall board up in the mid upper 140s. So I think calves at their worst were off about $100 to $150 a head. The impact on heavy feeders was actually worse. Now, admittedly, heavy feeders have gotten better the last few weeks, but if you go back and look at kind of that end of March, early April time period, depending on the weight of cattle, they were off between, in my opinion, 150 to as much as maybe $225 a head. So that was where your big impact was. Like I said, calf market's been largely flat. It's been between 140 and 150 on a state average basis, with one exception all year long. But I maintain we would have been in the 160s easily, maybe even 170s for larger groups back in the spring had we not had COVID-19. And our heavy feeders have improved. Larger groups were in the 125 to even low 130s for the 8 weights, the past couple of weeks. But I think they're still a dime off where they would have been. And at one point, like I say, we're down probably something closer to 30 cents or so a pound of where they actually would have been. So in terms of what it actually has done in terms of fundamentals, it's almost hard to get your head around the demand shock. That there is a wealth effect to layoffs and cancellations and things like that. But at the same time, you think about stimulus money and you think about unemployment benefits. We have kept, in my opinion, a lot of consumers with some purchasing power. And I think that's important as we think about what's happening at the retail level. So you combine that with this processing bottleneck, you've got consumers that have really seemed not all that price sensitive at the grocery store. And then this processing bottleneck that we're still working through, where you've got less meat coming out of the system, and it's been a recipe for what we've seen. The two things that I guess I'm going to be watching the most closely. The first are how much production are we pushing into the second half of the year? The truth is, we should have seen beef production pull back quite a bit, third and fourth quarter, but all indications are that because of what's happened, we're going to be pushing more of that into the third and fourth quarter, particularly the fourth, I think, actually now. So that's going to have an impact, I think, a lingering impact on cattle prices for the rest of 2020. And then I think what's really going to drive us in the short run is going to be what actually we see as more things start to reopen, we kind of move back to a normal. And how markets react, what happens with cases. We're watching states that have moved quicker, I think, to see how we might do at the national level. So I think both of those things are going to impact how significant the impact is on the cattle market for the balance of 2020. So, Will, those are all my prepared comments. I was trying to be fairly brief, and I will hand it back to you all.
Thank you, Kenny. And certainly, a lot of questions out there on the trade front and how consumers will react to this, in terms of going back to restaurants. We know that's a big part of the beef supply chain. So I think what we'll do is we'll let all our speakers make a few comments, and then we'll open up for questions. But again, if you've got some questions, send those to Emily through the chat feature there on Zoom. And I think at this point, we'll shift gears and talk to Dan Miller. Dan, as I mentioned, is in our current class. Dan heads up is the Kentucky Beef Network industry coordinator, and works a lot with producers out there in the state. And I guess, Dan, just make a few comments about what attitudes producers are hearing these days, how they're trying to respond to this, and things get tight. Do they pull back in terms of making investments to improve their beef herd or improve their forages, or what are you hearing out there amongst producers?
May I check on John real quick? Can you try to speak, John?
Yes, can you hear me?
We gotcha. All right.
All right, perfect.
Thanks, guys. Go for it, Dan.
All right. Well, it's been a crazy couple of months for us, obviously. Kenny talked about it hitting at a bad time, and that kind of goes along with the natural production cycle. People are trying to get the tobacco in the ground and getting hay made and getting all this stuff done, and trying to follow all the political moves and with the CARES Act and how can they get their payments and all this. So it's a very busy, very hectic time for everyone. If I summed it up with one question, when I go to producers' farms right now, they're asking, what's going to happen? What's the cattle cycle going to do? Or is it going to get worse? When's it going to get better? And obviously, none of us know the answers to these questions. But they follow that up with the CARES Act, and the payments. They're asking about details and what they need to collect and get it in. So we're helping them with that. We get a lot of questions about the ongoing investigation on the packers as well. That's something that we get a lot of questions on, that people are interested to see the outcome of that. So we're continuing to follow that and encourage a quick outcome of whatever they do follow up with those packers so that we have an answer. I think farmers are eternal optimists. We obviously have to be. So we're hoping that it's going to get better, but there's some real challenges ahead. I think as we have all these cattle stacked up on feed, these fat cattle, we've got to try to get them worked through. A lot of our packing plants are operating at some capacity now, anywhere from 50 to 90% essentially on those. So as we get those back up to speed, we're sure that the post-COVID maximums aren't going to be as high either, as those plants put in some protective measures for their employees and so forth, that we're not going to see the same capacities that we did 6 months ago out of those plants. So that's all still going to be a bottleneck for a little bit till we can work through it. But getting those cattle worked through the system, getting them out of the way, we're seeing lower placements. Obviously, folks that have cattle right now are holding on a little bit, seeing if prices get better, if there's a better time to sell them. And they can only do that for so long. So those animals are going to be coming to town. They're going to be a little bit larger, may shorten the window how long they have to be in those feed yards, but ultimately still have to get through the system. So there's still a lot of bottleneck and a lot of months, I think, for us to get this system worked out to where it's flowing smoothly like it's supposed to. So we're kind of just along. From a cattleman's standpoint, Kentucky cattleman's standpoint, we're following all this very closely, trying to make sure we get the information out to our producers on the act and how they can apply and all that, working with the FSA and following the investigation and answering these calls. In general, what we're hearing from a producer standpoint when it comes to the CARES Act payments, about half of them are happy, and those are the folks that happen to sell in that window, and about 50% of them aren't satisfied, maybe held on to them because the market was suppressed, so they haven't sold those calves yet and so on. So we're seeing it about 50-50 phone calls that come into our office that are satisfied and the others that are not. I know there's some more money coming down the pipeline that hasn't made out of the Senate yet, and we're just making sure that we've got our producers in a position that we can ask for some of that money and help some more folks that maybe didn't fit that initial window. So we're following it all very closely and trying to get as much of it as we can back down to our producers.
All right, Dan, thanks so much. I think anybody in business, no matter if they're in agriculture or whatever business you're involved in, the biggest problem that you have is uncertainty. And that's what we're all facing right now. It's a lot of uncertainty on the beef cattle side. So next, we're going to have John Sparks. John, as I mentioned, from my home county, Bourbon County, and in and out of the market probably on a daily basis, and probably nobody keeps as close an eye on the market as John out there. I'm sure he keeps his bankers pretty busy as well with all the cash flow dealing with this sector. And John, I watched a video of you this morning, actually the one that Ag Credit did of you a couple of years ago, and you were talking about this volatile period and a tough period we've had, but I guess none of us could have forecast, 3 years later, the volatility that we've seen in this market. So talk about what drives you, keeps you up at night, and where you see perhaps this industry headed to, and how you're responding to all the challenges that you face on a daily basis.
Yeah, sure. You bet. Yeah. So obviously we're in some very uncertain times, in America and globally as far as that goes. But as well as, the cattle market is, we've gone to the next level of volatility and uncertainty. And, for us as margin operators, so I'm a stocker backgrounder and we feed some cattle as well in Nebraska and Kansas, it's all based off margin, and the margin's been squeezed so much to where there really is no margin. And so, I always said the hardest thing for a man to do is to hedge a loss. And that's pretty much where the industry stands right now. On the yearling cattle, if you were to hedge those cattle, they'd be at a loss, no question, $10 a hundred loss. And, there's so many issues right now. To me, the most immediate issue is we have a $20 basis in the fat cattle. So we're sitting here trading fats for $120 if you can get them sold, in our nearby futures contracts under $1. So there's your risk management. Your futures contract's not even within $20 a hundred of the cash. So the only way you can mitigate risk throughout our markets is either forward contract, which doesn't exist, or you use the futures market. which in the live cattle is, $20 behind the cash. So obviously major problems there in basis. And I feel like the yearlings, there's some optimism in the yearlings right now for sure. There's definitely interest, but it's tough. It's as tough a times as I've seen. And as I've reminded my bankers, they're in the same situation as we are, as is Kentucky agriculture. We're made up pretty much cow-calf producers and a lot of cattle here. And I feel like this is a time where we have to use all the political assets we have to try to push to get some things done. There's a number of issues, everything that the Department of Justice is doing to just like I mentioned, the futures. But I'd be very concerned about the rest of this year. Thankfully, we're at a time period where we're on grass, and this didn't happen in the fall run. If this had happened in the fall run, there's no telling how cheap the calves would have been, as well as the yearlings. But thankfully, we're at a time where a lot of us can buy time with grass, and that's what we're doing. And of course, the cattle are getting very heavy. I've got 6 loads right now I'm trying to sell, and they're gonna pay 9 1/4 pretty easy. We normally move cattle at 850, so that's kind of I think that's what's going on in the country is everybody's just trying to buy time and try to get into a better time.
Yeah. I was on a call earlier this morning with some bankers, and we've been bridging this gap year in and year out and trying to get through the year, and it's really not necessarily on the beef cattle side, but the grain guys, the MFP kind of carried them along, and now we got CFAP. But their big concern right now from ag perspective is not necessarily 2020, it's 2021 and moving forward. And my comment was, well, from a sports analogy, you can't look, you need to plan ahead, but you've got to look at the team you're playing right now. Mm-hmm. And hope things improve from here on out. But anyway, tough year in 2020, but we got to deal with it. But an individual that probably been as busy, if not busier than anybody on this call, is our next panelist, and it's Ann Bays. Ann actually has some Tennessee ties. I kind of hold that against her, but she can kind of fill us in a little bit about her background. But Ann owns and operates a meat processing facility in southern Kentucky. She's from Whitley County. And I guess, Ann, it's been a busy time the past 2 or 3 months. I keep on hearing that the slaughter facilities are booked up to November, December, January. I heard one the other day, all the way till March or April of next year. So maybe tell us a little bit before you talk about your facility. I think you have a very interesting story about how you actually got into the meat processing business, and just a little bit of background, and then maybe fill in our audience what you are experiencing on a daily basis and how you're working with consumers and producers out there.
Yeah, as Will said, I am actually from Tennessee. If I turn my phone around, you could see my University of Tennessee diploma on my wall, and I'm very proud of that. But anyway, I'm a Kentuckian, and I don't plan to go anywhere now. I will say that Kentucky is much more friendly towards their farmers and their ag producers than Tennessee is. I go on record in saying that. But I did not grow up in agriculture. I realized my passion later. I did start out with 1 cow. That grew very quickly to a big herd. And if you'd asked me in the beginning, I would have said I was a cow-calf beef producer because I was selling beef directly to the public. And I did that for did the farmer's market thing for about 6 years, and learned a lot. One thing I learned is that farmers markets are exhausting. The other thing is that there is a really big demand for locally produced product. Through a series of events, I actually then moved from being the producer, which I still am, but on a smaller scale, to buying an existing small meat processing facility. And I've had that now for about 2.5 years, and I love it, but I have never experienced anything as crazy as what we are going through right now. It is absolutely, totally insane. I don't think anybody in this state can find a processing appointment in 2020 right now. I know I'm fully booked through the end of the year, and a month and a half ago, or even a month ago, if you had called me, I could have gotten you in a month. I mean, this is how fast this has changed. And I think that is the thing that has been the hardest for us, is that it came on us like a tidal wave. I'm now booked fully through December, and I have just started making a list of people who want me to call them when I have a January book to start booking appointments. I'm now at a page and a half. And it's real frustrating because I deal with a lot of small producers, and they're feeling the sting in so many different ways because, you know, they've got cattle that they're ready to sell, not the big herd type thing, but the smaller herd, and these animals are now ready to slaughter, and they have no place for these cattle. I'm regularly hearing things when people call me to get appointments booked that, you know, I'm costing them a sale because I can't increase their appointments from 2 to 4. Well, you know, my answer to that is, well, I'm killing my staff, which I am, you know, and myself, trying to just do what we're doing. I think right now there's a lot of things going on by the Department of Agriculture that's trying to help us small guys, and I really appreciate that. Unfortunately, it's coming at a time when all of us are running so hard and so fast, you know, that it's even hard for me to slow down and say, okay, I've got to put pen and paper to my needs at this point, and I will do that. But it is just, I mean, this is an unprecedented time, no doubt, and it is absolutely crazy. Yeah. It's like the perfect storm. You know, people couldn't get meat, and so now everybody who has a cow in their field says, I'm going to just eat my own cow, but they can't get it processed. And then anybody that has 3 cows in their field says, well, I'm going to go in the meat business because I'm not getting as much as I want out of the stock at the stock sales. I mean, it is literally the perfect storm that is really drowning all of our local processors right now. Yeah,
just crazy.
It is.
Warren, crazy. Maybe as a backdrop there, can you just give us a little update about the investment that you all are trying to make in terms of local meat processing and what reaction you've had so far?
Oh, we've been smothered as Ann a little bit in the few days it's been out there. It's a three level system, not counting anybody that wants to get into business new. We've had 5 or 6 calls about that, but level 1, we're not sure whether it'll work or not. When Ann's doing all she can do, we're going to incentivize you above a normal baseline, $100 for beef, $50 for hogs, $25 for sheep, $1 for chicken over that baseline. That's to incentivize us to do more, maybe run 2 hours more a day or stuff. Got a $20,000 a year cap, and that money can be used for anything. And typically, I think the big issue we get at most processing plants is labor, having people who, you know, it's tough work. Nobody wants to do it, and so that's the thing. Level 2 is we've got a 75% cost share up to $50,000, $37,500, total project $50,000, our part $37,500. That's to buy equipment. You got to justify how is this piece of equipment going to get you to process more Kentucky animals as such. And then level 3 is up to our part $250,000, and that's a $333,000. We do 75%, and it's meant to help people expand from the penning area through the kill floor to the cutting room, to the coolers, the freezers, to whatever you need. And then we got discussion with one group that is talking about a plant that might kill 450 a day, and that fits us perfectly. I mean, if John's taking his to 9 1/4, he's not very far from a place where he could get them through a plant like that. Our issue is, bottom line for ag development funds is how do we get the money back to the farmers? Dan Miller and Beef Solutions Group there has got the perfect example of how we turn them right now a $600 or $700 cow into $1,900 worth of hamburger. We've talked about possible co-oping part of ownership of this bigger processing plant. We've talked about retaining ownership all the way to the meat case, and so there's lots of opportunity. This is the first time, Will Snell, since I've been here, that the Ag Development Board said to me, we want to be proactive. We need more processing in the state of Kentucky. How do we do it? And I think we've become pretty aggressive about trying to get something out there. But I mean, Ann, you need to tell us how can we help you? If you're already doing all you can do, level 1's probably not going to help you much. But level 2 and level 3, if we can buy you some piece of equipment that's going to speed up and enable you to get more animals through your plant, that's exactly what we're trying to do. So that's it in the quick version.
Well, I want to say, Warren, I mean, as a processor, I truly appreciate you all. I mean, I feel like you really jumped on it. I know I was making some phone calls in some very frustrating days to saying, we need help. And you all definitely jumped on it. And I really, really do appreciate that. I'm a very small plant, but yeah, exactly.
They told me we got it passed already.
You did. I mean, I can't say enough good things about you, and I'm not going back to Tennessee, I promise. But here's just to give you an example. My kill rate right now has tripled from what it was a month ago. So I'm averaging triple the number of kills every week that I was. And my retail has also, I do have a retail component as well. Where I feel like I'm a little different is that I really focus my retail on local animals. So I try as hard as I can to buy from our local farmers, bring it into my plant, and that's what I sell to the people that buy from me. And so I think that sort of sets me apart from a lot of them. Of course, unfortunately, right now, I'm having to work really hard just to squeeze animals in for my store use, because I've just, like I said, it came on so fast. But I think you're right, Warren. I mean, whatever we do, we need to be very mindful that it comes back to our Kentucky farmers. It might go through a course, but it comes back to our Kentucky farmers.
Okay, at this point, again, if you got some questions to any of our panelists, just shoot them to Emily there and she'll update me. I'll keep the conversation going. Dan, talk to us a little bit about the hamburger deal with Kroger. How is that doing in the midst? It seems like folks can't afford those $20 fillets, but the hamburger you can't keep on the shelves quick enough.
That's right, Will. And we've been very blessed that we've been able to supply everything that Kroger has asked us for to this point. Obviously, when things started flying off the shelf, they started asking for more pretty quick, and we're almost doing what, like Ann, we're doing about 2.5 times what we were before the pandemic as far as the number ahead per week. But Kroger has continued to ask us for it. We've been lucky that Marksbury, where they process, has stayed healthy and stayed working full speed, and the same with Creation Gardens in Louisville. So both of our processors have been able to keep their lines moving at full capacity and putting a lot through. We aren't the only customer that they've really ramped up for. They're like everybody. They're wide open. So that's been good for us. Another benefit is we have a lot of a year. For the guys and so forth that are ready to be culled, and this gave them a good option. And those cull paid pretty good for those slaughter animals that were ready to harvest today, because all the plants were eating hamburger. Those prices actually did take too much of a hit through all this because they're ready to grind tomorrow, essentially. So that really helped me get through a lot of cows that were essentially on a wait list. Or some that weren't going to wait long enough to get in maybe middle or into the summer, that we would go ahead and get those things harvested. Another bright spot is it's allowed us to keep a Kentucky product on the shelves at Kroger. There's been lots of instances where they've been sold out of beef or had very little left, and what they had left was ours. And so far, Kroger has not adjusted the price on our hamburger in the store either. As the prices have crept up on everything else, we're still sitting there at $4.99 a pound on the shelf, same as we were. So as some of that generic commodity beef comes up and you're seeing it for almost $4 a pound or sometimes over in places, we're starting to look like a really good value for a verified local Kentucky product. So it's been good. It's been good for the producers to get those cattle harvested and through the system. It's been good for Kroger to have a product on the shelf, and it's been good for us to have it be our product and get it in the hands of some folks that maybe wouldn't have bought it otherwise that might continue to do so. But to echo Ann's comment, it's been very busy. It's been wide open. We've had to do alternate kill days. We've had, you name it, we've had to adjust. And that's the industry as a whole in the past 60 days is facing the same thing. But it's been a challenge that we've been able to meet so far, and we're proud of that accomplishment.
Yeah, I was in Kroger, I guess it was yesterday, and still I went over to the beef counter and saw it's still $4.99 a pound. And been hearing some of this out in the nation that hamburger was $7.99 a pound, but looked like Kroger was holding its own in terms of price. So, Emily, any questions?
Yes, so I received one from Hoppy that says disposal of the guts, bones, and blood. What are you doing with those byproducts?
So for
and
us, Mark's Berry is doing our harvesting, and they are taking those products. That's not something that Beef Solutions is taking and further marketing. The bones, they collect all those bones and have a truck that sends them off. I assume the guts and offal, all that stuff is going out the back door for rendering and so forth. But Beef Solutions, we do not sell that, handle that. Basically, Mark's Berry takes care of that product for us.
I've got pretty much the same answer. All mine comes back, is picked up on a weekly basis and goes off to the rendering plants. I do retain a lot of dog bones, if you will. And so we do sell those off of our inspected cattle because there is definitely a market that, but all the rest of our offal has gone away, just goes away. The one thing that has happened though, and this is not pandemic related, but we used to get paid back for our hides, and now we are getting nothing for our hides. We're just very lucky that the people are picking them up. But interestingly enough, I got a call from the people who does pick up our hides and offal, and he was complaining because our hides were now coming to him with too many nicks and cuts in them. And I said, well, guys, it's kind of hard for me to tell my skinning folks that they really need to be really super careful with these hides when I'm not getting a dime for them. But anyway, I thought that was interesting. That just happened yesterday.
All right. I've got another question. This one's from Aaron Miller. Question for Mr. Sparks. As Dr. Burdine noted, the cow herd has gone down some. Can you speak on how this impacts your backgrounder level? Is this shown in less cattle in the market? And do you have to source from a larger geographic area?
Sure, I'll be glad to comment on that. So, so far, I don't think it's had much of an impact on our market. We're still able to source all the calves we need through the way we have previously. Right now, the slaughter, the kill so far since the pandemic, we've backed up 1 million head of fat cattle. That's 1 million head of fat cattle that should have already been dead that are not dead yet. And so I personally don't think that us dropping some in our numbers of the cow herd is going to have much impact in the foreseeable future. I'm sure it will perhaps next year, but right now I don't think so. If you're feeding cattle in Kansas, I feed cattle in Kansas with a guy, and he said he had 5,000 fats that needed to be killed today. And he said, at best, we're moving 400 to 500 a week. So, and he's like, I can't tell you when I could even get you in. Now, that's not the case in Nebraska. The North's in a little better shape. So we have this big backlog that's in front of us, and all these cattle are going to go through this funnel, on a commercial level. Now, I'm not speaking of the local level, but on a commercial level, they're all going through the funnel, these packing plants, and we're 1 million head behind right now. And that every week it's getting better, the kill's getting better, but we're still, it's going to take a long time to chew through what we've got sitting in front of us. And not only is that slaughter, the number of head that's got to be killed, but these cattle are getting bigger. Weights are getting bigger every day. All these yearlings that are going into the feed yard are going in heavier, and when they go in heavy, they come out heavy. And so anyway, I don't think the drop in cow numbers is going to have any impact in the next 12 months.
All right. Thanks, John. Let's see. I've got another question. With so many schools and businesses planning for a second wave later in the year, what kind of impact should we be prepared for as beef producers? This comment was made by John, that we were fortunate it did hit when grass was coming in and not the fall. So what should we expect if another hit is in the fall? I think that's from Josh Long.
You want me to comment on that? Well, I think if we don't clean up, if we don't get this kill, cleaned up by the time we get to fall, I would expect prices to be, I think prices were pretty low this past fall. In my opinion, when we were buying calves and we were buying heifers for, we're buying 4-8 heifers for $1.10, I was thinking to myself, there is no way you could lose on these cattle. And I can tell you can lose on a 4-weight at $1.10. And so I can just tell you, all the guys that backgrounded cattle through the winter did not make money, period. If they made money at all, as has been the case for the last 12 months, if I feed a load of cattle in Nebraska or Kansas, or if I turn a load of cattle out on grass, the money that's being made is not cash to cash. The only money that's being made is being made by your position on a futures contract. And that's troubling. We should be very concerned about that. If production agriculture, there's no money made in production itself, and the only money's made on paper, at some point everybody's going to say, you know what? Well, I don't want to go here and feed these cattle. I'll just trade the paper and I'll make the same amount of money and don't have to do anything, So anyway, I'm not trying to be doom and gloom. I just feel like I'm a realist, and I would be very concerned about this fall's prices because the backgrounder who bought them last fall, and they were cheap, they wasn't cheap enough, and so anyway, and I'm hoping things get better. I am an optimistic person.
All right. Thank you for that. Dr. Sexton, our EKU advisory board rep, has jumped in with a question. Kroger is limiting the number of burgers you can buy. Does Kentucky Cattlemen's have any input on this restriction? And does summer cookout season, seems like they're limiting consumers to buy 2 packs of 4 burgers. I keep hearing questions from consumers. Is there anything we can do about that?
So that's a very good question that we have addressed for Kroger from the beginning. We've asked that they don't do that, but that's a Kroger decision. They're trying to keep it on their shelves for multiple folks to keep people from the hoarding buying that was going on at the beginning. We've asked them not to do it with our product. If they will ask for more, we will give them more, but they have not done that. They've made the decision to limit all beef products to those certain numbers depending on the store. And that's essentially not something that we are able to go around them to do. They buy the product from us, and then it's essentially theirs to market and sell out the back door. So we've encouraged them to take that limit off and let us supply you more as much as you need, and we'll get that to you. But that's not been something that they've been willing to do. So we still have that restriction on it as of today.
All right, thanks. Let's see, I've got a few other hoppy questions here.
While you're pondering which hoppy question to ask, let me get Kenny in the conversation here. You mentioned a little bit about trade expectations early on, and as I mentioned earlier as well, it's just a lot of tension on trade right now. What are you hearing in terms of moving more beef into China? Is Japan, how I assume their economy has been hit like the U.S. market, and what's the outlook on trade? And also just from a controversial standpoint, when we have at times limitations on our products on the shelves here in the United States, the issue of moving product overseas is, what do you, any comments regarding those issues?
Yeah, just real quickly, Will. So mentioned hogs earlier. So we're definitely seeing, a lot of pork in China because of African swine fever. But on the beef side, the impact on those markets has certainly been there. And of course, we've got additional demand domestically right now. And I don't know how long that'll last. So I think the net effect of this may actually be lower beef exports for 2020. And probably more beef imports. But we'll have to remember too, that's not always a bad thing, because I think in this case it may simply mean there's more demand here at home.
Okay. All right, Emily.
All right.
Have you been able
You
to
ready?
figure out Hoppy's question?
All right. If meat is not sold retail, can the grower sell the live animal and then not need federal inspectors nor approved location?
I don't know if it's a question for me or somebody else, but I mean, if you can sell a live animal to someone and they can process it themselves, or they can run it through even a non-USDA inspected plant if you're selling the live animal. But that's the key difference here.
Okay. He's also commented mad cow and use of off products. Does that mean anything?
Well, I guess I would just put in that, as far as from the mad cow standpoint, everything is tested. These like for Kentucky Cattlemen's ground beef, Marksberry, those kind of places where we're commercially putting food into the food chain. All that stuff is tested and goes through a process for that, for E. coli, for everything, antibiotic residuals, those sorts of things, to make sure that the product that we're sending out the back door is a safe product and is federally inspected. So there are things in place to catch those items to make sure that our food supply is safe. And I have been on the kill floor and watched those USDA inspectors go through the lymph nodes and the liver and those things and do those inspections. And it's if you've ever watched it done, it's a very thorough process, and you understand the importance that those people play in those packing houses.
Absolutely. Okay. Anthony Jones has a question for John. What is the % of cattle folks that do hedge with futures?
I think it depends on where you're at, and it depends on which segment of the industry you're in. So if you're a feed yard, I would say that number would be very high, in the 90 percentile range. I would say the average Kentucky backgrounder, it would be in the 50% range would be my guess. And again, I don't know. We generally, I change with the market, but we'll use a lot of options and so forth. But I would say we try to stay around 75%. But the margins are so small. You have to remember, if you're feeding cattle, the average profit is $40 a head. So you have no room to use options unless you use like a three-way option where you buy a put, sell a call, and sell a put below or something like that. You don't have any room to pay for an option because you're working off such a small margin. But so those guys will straight hedge. And also remember, live cattle are deliverable. So you have the threat of delivery, and that keeps the basis in line, except in this case where the basis is $20 out. But as I understand it, the long cannot force delivery. So that's allowed the basis to get so wide. But generally speaking, I think that just the feed yards will stay in the 90% range at least. And I would say on average, backgrounders will be 50 to 75%.
All right. Thanks, John. I think that's it for the questions I've received so far. We've got a few minutes left, so if anybody has one, jump in.
I've got one. I'm maybe again towards Kenny, but any of you can jump in. What's happening to the higher price cuts of beef in this economy with 70 to 80% of the restaurants closed? And I assume a lot of that's not exported. Where are those cuts ending up?
So with the caveat that those retail meat price series have their flaws, one of the things that I've observed, and I can't fully get my head around why, is we are seeing boxed beef prices come down the last 3 weeks. But if you look at price by cut, I've not seen it come down yet. And I think where you're going, Will, is would you have expected some of the more expensive meat cuts like ribeyes, strips, what have you, to get cheaper? I can't say that they have yet. But for some reason, we're reporting a box that has gotten cheaper the last 3 weeks.
Right. I assume a large percentage of those end up as part of the restaurant trade. And
Well, I can add into that just with knowing what we know with Kroger and our relationship. A month ago, they were taking a lot of that boxed beef and they were grinding it in-house to make hamburger because they literally could not get enough hamburger on the shelf. So they were taking those loins and those steaks and they were grinding them up and putting them in a package and selling them for a lot less money. Because they are just needing anything to put in a package to get out the door. So I know at least in Kentucky, the Kroger stores, they were doing that. They were just taking everything and grinding it up. So that's where some of it went initially when this all hit. And, they already had that boxed beef was out there ready to go to restaurants and so forth. When that shut down, that stuff got unboxed and ground up. And that's what happened to it, at least in the short term.
interesting.
How are they labeling that?
Well, they can, all the Kroger, they have a house brand, so they can take that stuff and grind it. They can take that ribeye and grind it up and sell it for a lot less money. They paid that ribeye price, but at the same time, that fresh product, they need to get it moved and get it off the shelf, and that's what the consumer wanted, so it was a way to get it out the door.
I've got an interesting comment on that, if I may. Last night, we were in Tennessee, in Knoxville, and went to Ruth Chris to eat dinner, and when we went to order, they said we don't have any ribeyes and no porterhouses and haven't for 2 weeks. Of course, I usually get the cowboy ribeyes, got the bone in it, the whole deal. And I thought, boy, ain't that something. Of the one cuts you would think there would be plentiful of would be that. And they said, well, I never could get a straight answer as to why, but they said for 2 weeks they've not had any ribeyes other than the petite ribeye available and no porterhouses. So I took it as they may not have been willing to pay the price of what they cost. When boxed beef, you think about 2 weeks ago, the restaurants trade open and prices, we had this stupid high boxed beef, $4.85, double the record. And Ruth Chris may have said, you know what, we're not going to pay that. And that's the only reason I could come up why they didn't have it.
Interesting.
Let's see. Anthony Jones jumped in with a question too. Any comments on Trump's statement about ending the import of cattle?
Well, I'll answer that one. I had to comment on it publicly last week. It's one of those issues where no matter what I say, I'll make half the folks mad, but definitely is what it is. The thing that I guess I would say is twofold. I think we have to be careful that we don't look at trade in an oversimplified manner. So we bring in a typical year, about 2 million head of cattle on the hoof, about half of those from Mexico, half from Canada. For Mexico, it tends to be a lot of what we would call stocker cattle or light feeder cattle that are either put on wheat pasture, finished here and processed here. And then from Canada, it tends to be more cattle that are ready for slaughter, some fed cattle, quite a few cull cows actually come in from Canada. So the first thing I always say is, we do have additional slaughter capacity and feed yard capacity in the United States because we bring cattle in on the hoof. We have to recognize that. If capacity is an issue now, by not having cattle imports, we probably wouldn't have as much capacity long term. And then secondly, I think it's difficult to pick and choose the pieces of international trade that you like and don't like, right? Mm-hmm. I don't think we can shut our doors to live cattle imports from Canada and Mexico and expect nothing to change in any other fashion with exports, for example. So I do think overall we benefit from trade, and I just think it's difficult to say we're going to stop doing A, but assume that B, C, and D still happen as they always have. Okay. Anyone else is welcome to comment, of course.
I guess the only small part I might add to that, and he's absolutely right. And even before the pandemic, when it comes to hamburger, this country, we need more lean trim to make that burger. We've got all the fatty trim we need from those finished animals. We're cutting out our high quality steaks and all the things that we like. But when it comes to grinding hamburger, we need some of that lean trim to come in to put with that because we're at a deficit where we eat so much hamburger, and that's only changed, at least the buying habits temporarily as well. So it is an important aspect that we do need some of that product to come in here to continue our supply as we're used to it.
All right, thanks. I've got, let's see, one more question over here from Julie Fritsch, which is really good. Any concern by the time that we've increased our slaughter capacity that the demand won't be there anymore? We tend to do that in ag.
Well, go ahead, Ann.
Okay, I'll start with that one. Obviously, being in the business, that is kind of a scary thing. It's like, how much am I going to change the way I operate on a day-to-day basis, not knowing if things are going to stay the way they are. However, I have seen such a big surge in the love of local products that I don't really see that happening. I think that can support a whole lot. And I don't see that turning around. That's not really pandemically created. It is, I think, even reinforcing in people's minds that they really want to buy local. And I don't see that totally going away at all.
Well, let me bring us home with one final question. We're fortunate to have our Executive Director of the Farm Service Agency on, Mr. Lacefield. You queued in. Got to take advantage of Ryan being on here. Just a quick update. Are we still leading the nation in terms of CFAP applications and any type of questions you're getting from beef cattle farmers regarding the application decisions?
Hey, good afternoon. I've enjoyed being part of this. Appreciate you all putting these together. Enjoyed listening to the panelists on everything, and it's been a nice. I've had to be on the phone a little bit as we're doing this. Got a lot going on in Kentucky right now. We're unfortunately not leading the nation. We did start off fast off the out of the gate, and for the first day we did lead the nation, but we're fourth right now. We've got 3,385 applications have been taken as of the last time my little dashboard updated. And that nationwide, we're at 58,000. So it's going fast. Like ranging from, we've had a lot of big difficult ones already submitted, and all the way to small, rather simple ones taking 5 minutes to process. Absolutely getting lots of calls and questions, and folks wanting explanations for why something was done a certain way. The national office has put together a very good frequently asked question part on if you go to farmers.gov, CFAP, there's a Q&A or a frequent asked question. It's fantastic. It's continuing to be updated. Just updated right before lunch was more specific definitions of contracts that are subject to market risk and those that are not. And it really, I think, simplifies some of the confusion that had initially been out there. As with any type of new program, especially of this magnitude, it's obviously going to have some hiccups as things roll out. And as many times as we think we'll have got it all figured out, got the guidance out to the field, we'll get a phone call with, well, it's a good question. We're going to have to figure it out. And luckily, if we're having it in Kentucky, somebody else is probably having it somewhere else in the nation, and they're updating it. So just know we've got a lot of producers and centers of influence here on this call. Just anything that we can do to encourage patients at the office. There's a lot of fear on funding. And I can let the economist here address that. Any that you want, all assurance we're getting is that this is going to be a program that has adequate funding by it. Part of that is how these rates and payment rates were calculated. There was a lot of thought, and a lot of the chief economist office worked through all this to look at is there going to be enough funds, and that's why some things were excluded. That's why payment rates were what they were. We have a good idea of what we're going to be paying out nationwide, but just to be sure and to be cautious, we've actually, as bankers, we call it give it a haircut. We got an advance rate at 80% that we're doing on this on the front end, just again to ensure we're able to get everybody paid on this. So I hope that can alleviate some of the fears that you've got to get into the office and sign up, because right now you can't physically get into the office. We have open offices, but we're not meeting customers inside the office. We're still working with this, and so it's a very for existing customers with historical records on file with as far as eligibility and compliance that you have to have. It's really now just one additional form that can be sent in electronically, so we don't even have to go in. but we are taking everybody's name that's calling, and in all of our offices, we're only allowed to bring in 2 folks at a time. So we have all folks taking incoming calls, putting producers' names down, and then having our teleworking employees call and go through the application with the customer. So if you call in and you're not able to do it immediately, that's protocol. We're actually taking the calls in and then having somebody return the call to the producer and walk through the application.
All right, thanks, Brian. I know we all join in saying the great admiration for what you and your staff are doing right now with monumental task for us. So.
Well, I know Director Beeler is wanting to know what Kentucky's share is going to be, and since Dr. Snell, you've got an estimate out there, why don't you tell Director Beeler what you think we're going to have in this program?
Well, we've made some assumptions on inventories and sales, and kind of tough to get a ballpark estimate. We're somewhere around 175 million. I've been doing the hedging 150 to 200 million, but hopefully you'll bring us home more than $200 million.
Well, that's
we
going to be significant impact. Just to put that into scale, the 2 MFP programs for the 18 and 19 crop totaled just over $400 million.
Right. And somebody told me the other day that we're going to find out, Kenny, that we may have more than 38,000 beef cattle producers out there. We're going to find some cattle we didn't know we had. So that will wind things up. Again, thank you all for joining us. Please give us some input, any other topics that you'd like for us to cover. It's good to see many of you all and get some different perspective. And again, we're here to try to keep this network of leaders involved and connected and informed as we move forward through these tough times. So hope everybody has a great weekend. Emily, any final words?
I just dropped my email in the chat box. So if you guys don't have that available, it's also on our website. But if you have any ideas or feedback on this, we'd love to hear it.
Thanks again, and everybody have a great weekend.
Have a great weekend. Thank you.